So let's talk about how to start a large project. What are your considerations first going into it? How are we going to define our scope and get things set up and just do the initial work so that we can dive into things. This is Love Field in Dallas, Texas, which is where I happen to live right now and is also our next project as a group. This is how it looks in the default P3D 4.5. And it's not too bad. I mean, the layout is more or less correct for the airport, although one of these runways has been removed since the data was given to Lockheed. Other than that, though, it's pretty generic. The landscape around the airport is very generic and also not terribly accurate. But at least it gives us some place to start. So what you see here, the first thing that I sort of consider when I'm doing any project, and certainly with this one, is what is the scope going to be? How much of this ground are we going to cover as part of the scenery package? And what is a good reason to leave things in, take things out, and just overall determine how much work is going to be involved in the thing. So I look around a project like this and I think, well, clearly the airport grounds and everything that's our green airport skirting here will definitely be part of it, because that's just expectation these days. Looking away from the airport at the environment around it, though, how true is it to real life? You know, how much of this do we want to, for instance, replace with ortho photos and our custom autogen, and how much can we get away with just leaving as it is in default? And then, other than that, are there points of interest around the airport that we want to include as well, be they VFR reference points, or just points that make this more unique to the area? Now, I decided pretty early on with Dallas that because Love Field is one of these airports, a vanishing breed of them now, that are very close in to the downtown area, which you can see in the sort of upper right-hand corner of the screen here is downtown Dallas. I decided that Dallas itself, the business district downtown, would be included as part of the package. Not only because it's such a presence when you're actually at the airport, but because depending on the weather, a lot of the approaches that come into here come straight over downtown and at a fairly low altitude. And so that means that you're going to get a really good view of downtown as you're flying into this airport, either that or as you're taking off most days. And Dallas has an interesting downtown area. It's sort of generic looking during the day, but it really lights up at night and turns into a fairly spectacular cityscape. So the night lighting can be fun for this too. I think it'll be a big selling point for the product. But you can see here, like just from the view looking from downtown off towards Love Field, which is sort of top center, definitely the downtown area factors heavily into flying into this airport. So how are we going to get started with this? Well, the first thing we want to do is I always start from the ground and work my way up. And the first thing I want to do is twofold. Decide whether or not I'm going to use the default terrain, and if I'm going to do custom terrain, start looking for the source data and compiling that into some custom files. And also doing the same for my ortho photo. My ortho imagery probably will be split into two sets. I'm going to have a lower resolution set that covers the greater Dallas area, including downtown, that is sort of intended to be seen from several thousand feet up. And then for the airport grounds, and maybe extending out just a bit all around it, will be a much higher resolution. I believe there's some 30 centimeter data available for this, which is sort of not as good as I would like. I mean, I'd love 15 if I could find it, but I haven't found any so far. 30 centimeters is not bad, and for the airport grounds, especially once there's that detail texture over the top, it should be pretty good. Now, I'm actually fairly familiar with part of this airport, which is the Bachman Lake area. That's the lake here at the foot of the runways, 1 through left and right. And let me zoom down to this. It really helps to have familiarity with the area before you get started, because you can see really quickly where the problem areas are, what you're going to need to change. If we get down really low here, you can see this area, the lake itself and the airport grounds, the runways, they're all flat. I have a feeling, especially given where the skirting is for this airport, see how it extends out beyond the lake, that the flatten for the airport also extends out to cover the whole lake area. And that might have been fine for Lockheed, but that's not actually what it looks like in real life. Just about every day during the week I walk on a trail around this lake. Not only is it good exercise, but it's right there by the threshold of the runway, which is really cool. You get to watch the 737s come and go. So it's a fantastic spot for a plane spotter to walk. But because of that, I know for a fact that the airport itself is elevated probably a good 10 or 15 meters above the lake area. The lake is sort of inset into a little valley at the foot of the runway, which clearly isn't the case here. So that being said, the first thing I'll probably do is remove the flatten. I'll just add a poly all the way around the airport to remove the airport background and the flatten, and see what the underlying terrain mesh really looks like. And then we'll decide from there whether or not we're going to need a custom mesh. I have a feeling we're going to, though. And we're certainly going to need the ortho photos. So the first thing we do, get the mesh together, get the source data together, find our ortho photos, and begin to compile that all. So next we're going to do the sometimes simple, sometimes really frustrating process of finding source data, both ortho imagery and terrain data for the project. Now it happens that I have looked into this area before. I had some bookmarks set up, so it should be fairly straightforward. Let's go for the terrain first. I happened to find a GIS website specific to Texas that has all sorts of wonderful Texas info. We've got ortho imagery, we've got terrain, we've got the magic word LiDAR, which means we're going to find some very high resolution terrain mesh. And if we're lucky, it'll be covering the area that we're working with. So the first thing I did was grab my base ortho imagery, which I believe it was the latest they had on here was the 2016 NAIP imagery. So let's go to the download tab here. I'm going to put all these URLs in with the video, so no worries there. And we see it must be really low resolution because this one tile, this one download covers the entire Dallas area. And it covers it, it's natural color, 3-band, 621 megabytes. So we'll just grab that and stick it in a folder, and that will be our ortho imagery. That's just our base overall ortho. And then let's see what we can find that's a little more high resolution. Let's try looking for Dallas here. We want some, it may be that we have to go elsewhere to find our high-res ortho imagery. Let's say Dallas and Fort Worth imagery. Go to our download tab and see if there's anything good there. This is roughly the area of, yeah, it's not bad. 150 megs for an area this big means it's probably not going to be that high resolution. I think I'm going to go to a national website, USGS, and look for that. I think what I'll do is go ahead and look for my elevation instead. So what do we got for elevation? We want to get it as recent as possible. I see the NED for 2013. That's a good 6 years ago now. Oh, check this out though, Dallas County LiDAR. Ooh, that should be nice. Yes, that's going to be good stuff. I'm going to grab that. And I'm going to grab it as a dim because I know point clouds, I just don't have the background to work with. Yeah, I'm used to working with dims, so I'll download that digital elevation model and throw that in my folder, and then I'll probably just grab from the National Elevation data set this one here. Now this is a 1 by 1 degree tile, which should do the job fine. We'll check it once we're in Global Mapper, but I'll download those as well. Next up, another of my favorite wonky, semi-hard to deal with tools that are very useful is Global Mapper. Now this is a payware product. I think it was about $500 some 10 years ago when I bought it, but 10 years on I'm still using it. It still more or less does what it needs to do. It's become a bit out of date now. This is version 10. I think they're up on like 18 or 19 now or more. But I found that this version does enough of what I need to make it workable. And I'll show you, like, let's get our terrain open here. Open your own data files. Without even unzipping the terrain mesh that I downloaded, I'm going to just choose the zip and hit open, and it'll import it in and show it in shaded relief. Alright, so this is the terrain. This is the overall DEM terrain that we downloaded. And it's pretty detailed. I'm thinking it's going to be more detailed than the default is anyway. So that's helpful. What I know, I cheated because I've already compiled this once and put it into the sim, is that it is still pretty coarse when it comes to like the area around Bachman Lake near the airport. It still doesn't look quite the way it should. However, I am going to bring in my LiDAR data as well. So if I see, I'm going to put that in elevation. Well, no, that wasn't it. Tell you what I'll do. I'll just go ahead and open up the file that I've already done here. Be easier than going through all this. So what we see here, and I have GeoTIFF for this is the Dallas area. So here's Love Field right here. Takes a minute to zoom into things. Alright, let's turn off the ortho for a minute and just look at our terrain. You can see what I've done is there's a patch of the ultra high resolution LiDAR data that's been laid over the top of just the Love Field area, and especially right around the lake. Bachman Lake here is sort of, it's a little creek that runs in and gets dammed up. And with that data in place, with this more high resolution laid in here, then we start getting like ultra detail when it comes to the terrain mesh. And now it looks really, really nice. So what I did was I chose an area. It was a pretty good sized area, not the entire 1 degree tile because that was too large, but I basically exported part of this. Here, I'll show you. So I hit export raster data, went to go do a GeoTIFF, and elevation is the file type, so 32-bit floating point samples. And then I went to bounds and hit draw a box and just exported what I thought I would need. Let me zoom out a little bit. So I know this is right in the middle of the screen is the airport area. This is downtown, kind of just to the north of this flatter area. So I just drew a boundary around all of the area that was going to be in our scenery, hit OK, and exported that as a GeoTIFF. Then from there, I had to just move on to resample it into actual scenery BGLs. So next up, we're back on our buddy Global Mapper, and we're going to take the ortho imagery that we downloaded and turn it into something we can use to resample and create BGLs to use in the sim. So I'm going to hit back open my own data files. Just for ease of use, I'm going to go with the 1 meter data here. Again, I can just directly open the zip file that I downloaded. Takes a minute, and it will bring it all into Global Mapper here. So this is the image that we have to deal with, the greater Dallas area. Now I can zoom into the area that I know we're going to be actually exporting, so we can get a better view of it here. That's not bad. It's not terribly high resolution, but it will work for a first cut. So we can just kind of lay out our ortho and mask it and see what it's going to look like sort of roughly in the end product. The first thing we got to do here before we do any exporting, though, is we have to reproject it. It's a very particular projection that we have to use to make things work in the sim, and it is there are two things we have to change in the projection. For one thing, we have to change it to geographic lat long, and then for our datum we have to use WGS 84. So with that set to geographic, that set to WGS 84, we can hit OK. And it takes a minute again, but it'll reproject it so that it'll be in a format that the sim can deal with. So now we have to export this as a geotiff that we can use to resample and create our base ortho imagery. So we're going to go up here to File, again to export raster and elevation, geotiff, but instead of for file type being elevation, since we're not doing that, we're going to do 24-bit RGB. And we're going to go back over to our export bounds. We're going to again draw a box, and we're going to just select this area, downtown Dallas, Love Field, and a little above and below it here, so that we can create this overall ortho photo area we're going to be using. So when I hit OK, it asks you to OK again. We can give the file a name and save it to our hard drive. I've already done that, so we're going to move on to the next step here. So in the last couple of steps before we're ready to have an initial cut for the scenery, I started by opening Scenery Builder X, S-Builder X, and drawing a couple of polygons around our airport. The larger pinkish one here is an exclude, where we're excluding all airport boundaries. And that will get rid of the green grass skirting around the airport by default. It will also, more importantly, get rid of the default flatten around the airport. And that means that our actual terrain levels, especially around the lake area here to the north of the field, can shine through. So I laid that down, and these, by the way, have their transparency turned back a little bit so you can see both them on top of each other and what's lying underneath them. And then the other poly that I made was to create my own flatten all the way around the airport grounds, sticking really tightly to the areas that I know our ground poly is going to cover, and trying to not flatten anything else so that the natural terrain from our high-res mesh can show through here. That's especially important along the top edge of the field here where it meets up with the lake. Now what happened, I believe the default airport was something like 147.3 meters in altitude. I noticed, again, cheated, I went ahead and did all this before the video, but I noticed that without the flatten, the airport being at 147.4 meters was just a little bit high, was set up so that it poked up and out of the surrounding terrain by a meter or two. So what I ended up doing was making it 145 meters for my flatten, and we also I changed the elevation of the airport in ADE, which we'll do in just a minute. But I made this flatten go all the way around the airport, 145 meters, set it to AB flatten for the polygon type, and then I was able to export these two as a BGL as well. Then once I had done that, opened up Airport Design Editor. Go away. And I did a couple of things there too. I got rid of all the buildings the generic buildings and the library objects that were around the airport, because I just didn't feel like we needed them. We're going to be replacing them all anyway, so I wanted to just clear them off, start with a completely clean table, so that we can do the work that needs to be done. I did leave the hard surfaces here because they'll be handy for providing something to lay underneath our ground poly and actually harden up the surface. So I didn't touch the parking yet. I haven't touched the aprons or any of that. And then I also went under tools to change airport reference data, and I bumped it down from 147.4 to 145 meters. Hit change. That does two things. Not only does it reset the altitude of the airport, but when you hit compile, it creates an altitude adjustment BGL, which has, for some reason still, even in P3D 4.5, has to go into the Scenery World Scenery folder in order for the actual airport elevation change to be noticed by the sim and to be picked up and displayed. So we've cleaned up all our objects, we've reset the altitude, we have created our flatten and our exclude, we have got the ortho photos in, we've got the custom terrain in. Let's go have a look and see how it all works out. And here we have it. And I have to say, it's looking 1,000% better than it did in the initial view we had in P3D from before. We got a whole bunch of things at play here, and we'll take them apart one by one. One of them is, you'll notice the auto gen is gone from around the area, and that's because we laid down that large patch of 1 meter ortho photo, which in P3D at least automatically blanks out any auto gen that's beneath it. So we've got the areas all cleared off and ready for us to start building in. It is, as predicted, the 1 meter ortho photo is not great. It's not very high res, and I have a feeling it's not what we're going to use. I think we're going to go for probably 60 centimeter data in the final. One way I use to check it is I get sort of lined up on a runway center line here, and like I'm on 13 right now, and I get on glide slope, and I look down beneath me at what the ground looks like when I'm on glide slope, and it's pretty fuzzy. This is not really acceptable resolution for an ortho photo for a commercial scenery package, but it will do in this case as a first pass, so that we can use it just to place buildings and to get the auto gen kind of dialed in. And then what we'll do is come back around after we're done doing the base auto gen, and I'll do a higher res version of the same thing, same masking and all that, and see if we can't get a much better look. However, check this out. This is the part that sort of tickled me the most. This is where it really shines to have high resolution terrain. Get in nice and close so you can see it. So you remember how the entire airport and the lake area were all flat, and we're just all on one plane before. Now this looks like the area that I actually walk in the morning. You can see that the flatten is just right for the lake. The road around the lake is elevated a bit, and you come over here. There's actually this will be fun to put in. There's actually a cinder block wall along here, which is what that sort of stripe of gray is, that separates the road area from the actual airport movement area. But it's really, you got a lot of nice gradations, a lot of nice terrain here that just, since I'm so familiar with the area, it really tickles me. It really looks a lot more like exactly what we're gonna, exactly like the real thing. Now there was an intermediate step, and those of you who've been following on the forum know that this drove me crazy for about a week. I wrestled with this, and that is that when I did my initial flatten in SBuilder X, it didn't fit well with the surrounding terrain, and the reason is that while in some areas, like dropping the elevation to 145 meters made this end of the runways 1-3 left and right, made them pretty much to flatten blended nicely with the terrain. The problem with high-res terrain is that it really shows all the various minor variations as you move across the landscape. And what I discovered is that as you move south with this particular airport, the terrain basically just gently lifts by about 4 to 6 meters by the time you're down at the other end of the airport, all the way around. And what that means is when you lay down a flatten that is, by its very nature, very consistently flat, the area, the edge where that flatten meets up with the surrounding high-res terrain, either is on a plateau if your flatten is higher than the surrounding terrain, or is sunk down in this very sharp-edged valley if your flatten is at a lower elevation than the terrain. So what I would get is down by the thresholds of 1, 3 left and right, it would look great. And then as I move north, the terrain will be more and more sunken. The airport will be more and more sunken down into the terrain with this weird mesh wall. So what I was trying to do was find a way to smooth out my original terrain mesh so that it didn't have all those distinctions. So I could make an area that was 145 meters in elevation, covered the entire airport, but then very smoothly blended away as you move away from the airport. And I thought originally that I could do that in Global Mapper through some combination of turning the elevation into a black and white height map, editing that height map in Photoshop, and it, for a lot of reasons, turned into a real nightmare to get done. And so what I ended up doing, the way I got my final solution, weirdly enough, was to launch a program called Terrain Sculptor, or I guess Terrain Sculptor Pro to be technical about it, which is available on scenerydesign.org. I have mixed feelings about it. The idea, what it's supposed to do is allow you to create a series of sloped flattens that can do essentially what I was trying to do. That you can connect your flat areas to your custom, undulating terrain in a way that's smoother and where you don't notice the boundaries as much. Every time I try to use Terrain Sculptor, I have problems. It drives me crazy. It crashes every time I open it practically. Like I have moments where it feels like you can't even move a vertex without the thing crashing on you. And when it would crash, it would take all the data with it. So I was really resistant to using it this time around. And then I finally, yesterday, opened it up and thought, okay, I'm just going to give it one more shot because I'm having so much trouble with this. And I guess I found my happy spot with it and was able to make it work. It didn't crash on me. I learned when to save, and it's frequent, believe me. So the long and short of all that is that I was able to create sort of an intermediate mesh in between my flatten and the surrounding terrain that joined the two together. And essentially, you can kind of see it here. If I get low enough to the ground, that what happens is our flatten goes right up pretty much to the road around the airport, and you can see the terrain just begins to rise after that up to its actual height. So the airport is in a bowl, but it's a very gradual, very gentle slope down. That is not 100% accurate to the real world, but it's not far off, and it's much easier to look at in the sim. It's much more homogeneous and doesn't grab your eye, call all your attention to the mistakes in the scenery. So that's what we're looking for here. It's just a way to sort of bridge that distance between reality and what looks good in the sim. So now we've got this really gloriously detailed terrain mesh, a nice flatten up on top that is going to keep everything at one level, and we've got our sloped flatten all the way around that kind of blend the two together and make it work. Now there are a couple of small spots I want to work on still, but essentially this is it. It's working, it's in good shape, and it's a fantastic basis that we're going to use to actually start building on the project.